During the 11th and 12th centuries, Sweden gradually became a unified Christian kingdom that later included what is today Finland. During the early Middle Ages, the Swedish state also expanded to control Norrland and Finland. Modern Sweden started out of the Kalmar Union formed in 1397 and by the unification of the country by King Gustav Vasa in the 16th century. Vasa fought for an independent Sweden and broke with the papacy, establishing the Lutheran Church in Sweden. In the 17th century, Sweden expanded its territories to form the Swedish Empire. Most of these conquered territories had to be given up during the 18th century. During the 17th century, after winning wars against Denmark, Russia, and Poland, Sweden emerged as a great power by taking direct control of the Baltic region. Sweden's role in the 30 Years' War determined the political as well as the religious balance of power in Europe. The Russians won a war against Sweden in 1709, capturing much of the Swedish army. Sweden joined in the Enlightenment culture of the day in the arts, architecture, science and learning. Between 1570 and 1800, Sweden experienced two periods of urban expansion. Finland was lost to Russia in a war in 1808 to 1809. In the early 19th century, Finland and the remaining territories outside the Scandinavian peninsula were lost. After its last war in 1814, Sweden entered into a personal union with Norway which lasted until 1905. Since 1814, Sweden has been at peace, adopting a non-aligned foreign policy in peacetime and neutrality in wartime. Sweden was neutral in World War I. Post-war prosperity provided the foundations for the social welfare policies characteristic of modern Sweden. Sweden created a successful model of democratic socialism. Sweden remained neutral during World War II, avoiding the fate of occupied Norway. Sweden was one of the first non-participants of World War II to join the United Nations. Apart from this, the country tried to stay out of alliances and remain officially neutral during the entire Cold War. It never joined NATO. The Social Democratic Party held government for 44 years. The 1976 parliamentary elections brought a liberal, right-wing coalition to power. During the Cold War, Sweden was suspicious of the superpowers, which it saw as making decisions affecting small countries without always consulting those countries. With the end of the Cold War, that suspicion has lessened somewhat, although Sweden still chooses to remain non-aligned. Prehistoric Sweden before AD 800. Sweden, as well as the adjacent country Norway, has a high concentration of petroglyphs throughout the country, with the highest concentration in the province of Bohuslän and around Gammelby and Västervik in northern county of Kalmar, also called Tegist. The earliest images can, however, be found in the province of Jämtland, dating from 5000 BC. They depict wild animals such as elk, reindeer, bears and seals. The period 2300–500 BC was the most intensive carving period, with carvings of agriculture, warfare, ships, domesticated animals, etc. Also, petroglyphs with themes have been found in Bohuslän. These are dated from 800–500 BC. Viking period and Middle Ages, 800–500. For centuries, the Swedes were merchant seamen well known for the far-reaching trade. During the 11th and 12th centuries, Sweden gradually became a unified Christian kingdom that later included Finland. Until 1060, the kings of Uppsala ruled most of modern Sweden except the southern and western coastal regions, which remained under Danish rule until the 17th century. After a century of civil wars, a new royal family emerged, which strengthened the power of the crown at the expense of the nobility, while giving the nobles privileges such as exemption from taxation in exchange for military service. Finland was taken over. Sweden never had a fully developed feudal system, and its peasants were never reduced to serfdom. The Vikings from Sweden mainly traveled east into Russia, but also took part in the raids of the west and southern regions of Europe. The large Russian mainland and its many navigable rivers offered good prospects for merchandise and, at times, plundering. During the 9th century, extensive Scandinavian settlements began on the east side of the Baltic Sea. The conversion from Norse paganism to Christianity was a complex, gradual, and at times possibly violent process. The main early source of religious influence was England due to interactions between Scandinavians and Saxons in the Danelaw, and Irish missionary monks. German influence was less obvious in the beginning, despite an early missionary attempt by Ansgar, but gradually emerged as the dominant religious force in the area, especially after the Norman conquest of England. Despite the close relations between Swedish and Russian aristocracy, there is no direct evidence of Orthodox influence, possibly because of the language barrier. About 1000, the first king known to rule over both Svealand and Götaland was Olaf Konung, but the further history is obscure, with kings whose periods of regency and actual power is unclear. In the 12th century, Sweden was still consolidating with the dynastic struggles between the Erik and Sverker clans, which finally ended when a third clan married into the Erik clan and founded the Folkunga dynasty on the throne. This dynasty gradually consolidated a pre-Kalmar Union Sweden to a strong state, and King Magnus IV also ruled over Norway and Scania. Following the Black Death, this union was severely weakened, and Scania was lost to Denmark. During the early Middle Ages, the Swedish state also expanded to control Norrland and Finland. Exactly how this happened is not entirely clear. Some of the crusades to christen the Finns that are mentioned in some sources are considered unhistorical. What is clear is that this expansion sparked tension with the Russian states, tension that was to continue through Swedish history. After the Black Death and internal power struggles in Sweden, Queen Margaret I of Denmark united the Nordic countries in the Union of Kalmar in 1397. With the approval of the Swedish nobility, continual tension within the countries and within the Union gradually led to open conflict between the Swedes and the Danes in the 15th century. However, the Union's final disintegration in the early 16th century brought on a long-lived rivalry between Denmark on one side and Sweden on the other. Modern Sweden, 1523 to 1611. In the 16th century, Gustav Vasa fought for an independent Sweden, crushing an attempt to restore the Union of Kalmar and laying the foundation for modern Sweden. At the same time, he broke with the papacy and established the Lutheran Church in Sweden. The Union of Kalmar's final disintegration in the early 16th century brought on a long-lived rivalry between Norway and Denmark on one side and Sweden on the other. The Catholic bishops had supported the Danish king Christian II, but he was overthrown by Gustavus Vasa, and Sweden was now independent again. Gustavus used the Protestant Reformation to curb the power of the Church and became King Gustavus I in 1523. In 1527 he persuaded the Radag of Vasteras to confiscate church lands, which comprised 21% of the farmland. Gustavus took the Lutheran reformers under his protection and appointed his men as bishops. Gustavus suppressed aristocratic opposition to his ecclesiastical policies and efforts at centralization. Tax reforms took place in 1538 and 1558, whereby multiple complex taxes on independent farmers were simplified and standardized throughout the district. Tax assessments per farm were adjusted to reflect ability to pay. Crown tax revenues increased, but more importantly the new system was perceived as fairer and more acceptable. A war with Lübeck in 1535 resulted in the expulsion of the Hanseatic traders, who previously had a monopoly of foreign trade. With its own businessmen in charge, Sweden's economic strength grew rapidly, and by 1544 Gustavus controlled 60% of the farmlands in all of Sweden. Sweden now built the first modern army in Europe, supported by a sophisticated tax system and government bureaucracy. Gustavus proclaimed the Swedish crown hereditary in his family, the House of Vasa. It ruled Sweden and Poland. Early modern. During the 17th century, after winning wars against Denmark, Russia, and Poland, Sweden emerged as a great power by taking direct control of the Baltic region, which was Europe's main source of grain, iron, copper, timber, tar, hemp, and furs. Sweden had first gained a foothold on a territory outside her traditional provinces in 1561, when Estonia opted for vassalage to Sweden during the Livonian War, while in 1590 Sweden had to cede Ingria and Kexholm to Russia, and Sigismund tried to incorporate Swedish Estonia into the Duchy of Livonia. Sweden gradually expanded at the eastern Baltic during the following years. In a series of Polish-Swedish War and the Russo-Swedish-Ingrian War, Gustavus Adolphus retook Ingria and Kexholm as well as the bulk of Livonia. Sweden's role in the 30 Years' War determined the political as well as the religious balance of power in Europe. From bridgeheads in Stralsund and Pomerania, the Swedish army advanced to the south of the Holy Roman Empire, and in a side theatre of the war deprived Denmark, Norway of Danish Estonia, Jämtland, Gotland, Halland, Härjedalen, Idre and Sauna, became exempted from the Sound dues, and established claims to Bremen-Verden, all of which was formalized in the Treaty of Bromsebro. In 1648, Sweden became a guarantee power for the Peace of Westphalia, which ended the 30 Years' War and left her with the additional dominions of Bremen-Verden, Wismar and Swedish Pomerania. Since 1638, Sweden also maintained the colony of New Sweden along the Delaware River in North America. Sweden as a great power 1648 to 1721. In 1655, in the Second Northern War, Charles X Gustav of Sweden invaded and occupied western Poland, Lithuania, the eastern half of which was already occupied by Russia. The rapid Swedish advance became known in Poland as the Swedish Deluge. The Grand Duchy of Lithuania became a Swedish fief. The Polish-Lithuanian regular armies surrendered and the Polish King John II Casimir Vasa fled to the Habsburgs. The Deluge lasted for 5 years and took a great toll on Poland and Lithuania, with some historians crediting this invasion as the start of the downfall of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The country was devastated, treasures stolen and taken back to Sweden, and insurmountable loss of lives occurred. Sweden was able to establish control of the eastern bank of the Sound, formalized in the Treaty of Roskilde, and gain recognition of her southeastern dominions by the European great powers in the Treaty of Oliva. Yet, Sweden was barred from further expansion at the southern coast of the Baltic. That Sweden came out of the Scanian War with only minor losses was largely due to France forcing Sweden's adversaries into the treaties of Fontainebleau and Saint-Germain. The following period of peace allowed Charles XI of Sweden to reform and stabilize the realm. He consolidated the finances of the crown by the Great Reduction of 1680. Further changes were made in finance, commerce, national maritime and land armaments, judicial procedure, church government and education. The Great Northern War 1700 Russia, Saxony, Poland, and Denmark. Norway pulled the power in 1700 and attacked the Swedish Empire. Although the young Swedish King Charles XII won spectacular victories in the early years of the Great Northern War, most notably in the stunning success against the Russians at the Battle of Narva, his plan to attack Moscow and force Russia into peace proved too ambitious. The Russians won decisively at the Battle of Poltava in June 1709, capturing much of the exhausted Swedish army. Charles XII and the remnants of his army were cut off from Sweden and fled south into Ottoman territory, where he remained 3 years. He outstayed his welcome, refusing to leave until the Ottoman Empire joined him in a new war against Tsar Peter I of Russia. In order to force the recalcitrant Ottoman government to follow his policies, he established, from his camp, a powerful political network in Constantinople, which was joined even by the mother of the Sultan. Charles's persistence worked, as Peter's army was checked by Ottoman troops. However, Turkish failure to pursue the victory enraged Charles, and from that moment his relations with the Ottoman administration soured. During the same period, the behavior of his troops worsened and turned disastrous. Lack of discipline and contempt for the locals soon created an unbearable situation in Moldavia. The Swedish soldiers behaved badly, destroying, stealing, raping, and killing. Meanwhile, back in the north, Sweden was invaded by its enemies. Charles returned home in 1714, too late to restore his lost empire and impoverished homeland. He died in 1718. In the subsequent peace treaties, the Allied powers, joined by Prussia and Great Britain, Hanover, ended Sweden's reign as a great power. Russia now dominated the north. The war-weary Riksdag asserted new powers and reduced the crown to a constitutional monarch, with power held by civilian government controlled by the Riksdag. A new age of freedom opened, and the economy was rebuilt, supported by large exports of iron and lumber to Britain. The reign of Charles XII has stirred great controversy. Historians have been puzzled ever since why this military genius overreached and greatly weakened Sweden. Although most early 19th century historians tended to follow Voltaire's lead in bestowing extravagant praise on the warrior king, others have criticized him as a fanatic, a bully, and a bloodthirsty warmonger. A more balanced view suggests a highly capable military ruler whose oft-reviled peculiarities seem to have served him well, but who neglected his base in Sweden in pursuit of foreign adventure. Slow to learn the limits of Sweden's diminished strength, a party of nobles, who called themselves the Hats, dreamed of revenge on Russia and ruled the country from 1739 to 1765. They engaged in wars in 1741, 1757, 1788, and 1809, with more or less disastrous results as Russian influence grew after every Swedish defeat. Enlightenment Sweden joined in the Enlightenment culture of the day in the arts, architecture, science and learning. A new law in 1766 established for the first time the principle of freedom of the press, a notable step towards liberty of political opinion. The Academy of Science was founded in 1739 and the Academy of Letters, History, and Antiquities in 1753. The outstanding cultural leader was Carl Linnaeus, whose work in biology and ethnography had a major impact on European science. Following half a century of parliamentary domination came the reaction. King Gustav III came to the throne in 1771, and in 1772 led a coup d'état with French support that established him as an enlightened despot, who ruled at will. The age of freedom and bitter party politics was over. Precocious and well-educated, he became a patron of the arts and music. His edicts reformed the bureaucracy, repaired the currency, expanded trade, and improved defense. The population had reached 2.0 million and the country was prosperous, although rampant alcoholism was a growing social problem. Gustav III weakened the nobility and promoted numerous major social reforms. He felt the Swedish monarchy could survive and flourish by achieving a coalition with the newly emerged middle classes against the nobility. He personally disliked the French Revolution, but he decided to promote additional anti-feudal reforms to strengthen his hand among the middle classes. When Gustav made war on Russia and did poorly, he was assassinated by a conspiracy of nobles angry that he tried to restrict the privileges for the benefit of the peasants. Under King Charles XIII, Sweden joined various coalitions against Napoleon, but was badly defeated and lost much of its territory, especially Finland and Pomerania. The king was overthrown by the army, which in 1810 decided to bring in one of Napoleon's marshals, Bernadotte, as the heir apparent. He had a Jacobin background and was well grounded in revolutionary principles, but put Sweden in the coalition that opposed Napoleon. He served as a quite conservative King Charles XIV John of Sweden. Colonies and slavery. Sweden experimented briefly with overseas colonies, including New Sweden, in colonial America in the 1640s. Sweden purchased the small Caribbean island of St. Barthélemy from France in 1784, then sold it back in 1878. The population had included slaves until they were freed by the Swedish government in 1847. Early urbanization. Between 1570 and 1800, Sweden experienced two periods of urban expansion, c. 1580 to 1690, and in the mid-18th century, separated by relative stagnation from the 1690s to about 1720. The initial phase was the more active, including an increase in the percentage of urban dwellers in Stockholm, a pattern comparable to increasing urban populations in other European capital and port cities, as well as the foundation of a number of small new towns. Increasing populations in the small towns of the north and west characterized the second period of urban growth, which began around 1750 in response to shifts in Swedish trade patterns from the Baltic to the North Atlantic. 19th century. Loss of Finland. 1809 Finland was lost to Russia in a war that lasted from February 1808 to September 1809. As a result of the peace agreement, Finland became a Grand Duchy and thus was officially ruled by the Tsar of Russia, though was not strictly part of Russia. Union with Norway. 1814 Indiana. 1810 French. Marshal Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte, one of Napoleon's top generals, was elected Crown Prince Charles by the Riksdag. In 1813, his forces joined the Allies against Napoleon and defeated the Danes at Bornholm. In the Treaty of Kiel, Denmark ceded mainland Norway to the Swedish king. Norway, however, declared its independence, adopted a constitution, and chose a new king. Sweden invaded Norway to enforce the terms of the Kiel Treaty. It was the last war Sweden ever fought. After brief fighting, the peace established a personal union between the two states. Even though they shared the same king, Norway was largely independent of Sweden, except Sweden controlled foreign affairs. The king's rule was not well received, and when Sweden refused to allow Norway to have its own diplomats, Norway rejected the King of Sweden in 1905 and selected its own king. During Charles XIV's reign, the first stage of the Industrial Revolution reached Sweden. This first takeoff was founded on rural forges, textile proto-industries and sawmills. The 19th century was marked by the emergence of a liberal opposition press, the abolition of guild monopolies in trade and manufacturing in favor of free enterprise, the introduction of taxation and voting reforms, the installation of a national military service, and the rise in the electorate of three major party groups: Social Democratic Party, Liberal Party, and Conservative Party. Modernization of Sweden. 1860 to 1910. Sweden, much like Japan at the same time, transformed from a stagnant rural society to a vibrant industrial society between the 1860s and 1910. The agricultural economy shifted gradually from communal village to a more efficient private farm-based agriculture. There was less need for manual labor on the farm, so many went to the cities, and about 1 million Swedes emigrated to the United States between 1850 and 1890. Many returned and brought word of the higher productivity of American industry, thus stimulating faster modernization. In 1873, Sweden and Denmark formed the Scandinavian Monetary Union. The late 19th century saw the emergence of an opposition press, the abolition of guild monopolies on craftsmen, and the reform of taxation. 2 years of military service was made compulsory for young men, though there was no warfare. The steady decline of death rates in Sweden began about 1810. For men and women of working age, the death rate trend diverged, however, leading to increased excess male mortality during the first half of the century. There were very high rates of infant and child mortality before 1800. Among infants and children between the ages of 1 and 4, smallpox peaked as a cause of death in the 1770s, 1780s and declined afterward. Mortality also peaked during this period due to other air, food, and waterborne diseases, but these declined as well during the early 19th century. The decline of several diseases during this time created a more favorable environment that increased children's resistance to disease and dramatically lowered child mortality. The introduction of compulsory gymnastics in Swedish schools in 1880 rested partly on a long tradition, from Renaissance humanism to the Enlightenment, of the importance of physical as well as intellectual training. More immediately, the promotion of gymnastics as a scientifically sound form of physical discipline coincided with the introduction of conscription, which gave the state a strong interest in educating children physically as well as mentally for the role of citizen soldiers. Skiing is a major recreation in Sweden, and its ideological, functional, ecological, and social impact has been great on Swedish nationalism and consciousness. Swedes perceived skiing as virtuous, masculine, heroic, in harmony with nature, and part of the country's culture. A growing awareness of strong national sentiments and an appreciation of natural resources led to the creation of the Swedish Ski Association in 1892 in order to combine nature, leisure, and nationalism. The organization focused its efforts on patriotic, militaristic, heroic, and environmental Swedish traditions as they relate to ski sports and outdoor life.